today.
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you, Ethan and Ryan, as well as your organizations, American Gap and Building Bridges Coalition, for your leadership in this area. I do have some presented remarks today. I'll just give a little overview of where I'm going here, but I would love to find out a little bit more about who's on the line and what their interests are. So we'll go to that in just a moment. So I will be sharing guidelines for ethical global partnerships that were inspired by community organization colleagues in the Global South. That the guidelines for fair trade learning emerged from the Global South is central to the ethos of fair trade learning because service learning and most of the best forms of participatory research, community development, and public health have strong roots in reciprocity and mutual learning. I wanted to get that framing kind of and the genesis coming from the Global South out of the way to start. But before getting too deep into the presentation, I was just curious if I believe everyone can see a box in the bottom right where they can chat. And I wonder if you chat there, I don't think it goes to everyone, but it may go to Ethan. And I'd love to find out a little bit more about what brings people here. So if you could send to Ethan some thoughts on what you hope to get out of your time today, or what your pressing issues are in this area, he'll share that with the rest of us as those things come in. And I'm just going to wait a moment because it's so important to be able to speak directly to who's on the call. We all enter this from so many different places: NGOs, study abroad organizations, community organizations, study abroad offices, service learning offices, high schools, colleges. So I will just take a moment and give you a moment to chat in and share what you're hoping to get out of the time here and what your pressing issues are. I'll actually talk a little bit more about this. The other reason I ask about this is because those of us involved in fair trade learning very much see ourselves as collaborators in an effort to ensure ethics across a sector. We're well aware, as I'll talk about in a little bit here, that there are a number of perverse incentives in this space. So for me, knowing who people are and what they want is important because I'm regularly meeting people who are as passionate about coalition building and movement building to ensure that there's a strong voice out there for ethical partnerships. So I'd love to find out who's on the line, and as soon as they come in, Ethan can share some of that with us.
One comment from an attendee says, I've learned that a really strong framework is the key to a great online learning course. When ServeSmart, the organization that Ryan works for, is doing a total rebuild of the Impact Abroad toolkit, they're going to want to ground it in an A framework, and he's excited to learn about fair trade learning as an option for that base level framework on their toolkit.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else? Please do type it in. This is going to be ending sort of a somewhat discussion-focused webinar, and so in learning to interface and interfacing with the control panel is kind of the only way to do it, so we don't have 15 people all talking to each other at the same time. So please don't be shy in typing your questions or thoughts out.
And I'll just say one more time where that is, and I'll keep moving forward, but please do interrupt with questions, and Ethan, if you see more comments coming in, please do interrupt. So in the control panel, the gray rectangular box that you see, there should be a space where you can type in comments in the bottom of that, and they will go to Ethan.
Great. Eric, I have a few more to share too.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, no worries. When working with partners who want to work with us for service placements abroad, I'm struggling with universities and colleges who do not take into consideration the ethics of the program. I think we can all relate to that. And then another one, I'm just becoming aware of this concept of fair trade learning and would like to learn more. Our service learning department is starting to collaborate more with our study abroad department, and this might be a great area of discussion. And that's what we have for now, so please keep them coming, and Eric, take it away.
Yeah, those are great places to connect in, and I just want to comment on the two before launching off here. So we are seeing strong advocacy from NGOs and community-based organizations to really use this framework more and more to get universities to I think just awaken in many ways to the many ethical issues involved here. Of course, so many of us in our work are pressed to look at bottom lines and diminishing budgets so regularly that we can sometimes forget. But one thing about this framework is it lays out where the decisions that relate to ethics are, and can be a useful tool, especially since more and more institutions and organizations are using it to say, this is a framework that's been developed across a number of different partnerships. Why don't we work through it and see what we can do here to support. In many ways, it's supporting the ideals of global citizenship and community-driven development, supporting those ideals in practice while educating for them. And they're really nearly impossible to do separately. And service learning study abroad offices coming together, that's a passion area of mine, and one that we'll see, I think, a lot about in this presentation. So just a few key commitments to fair trade learning, and I will break these down as we move forward. But fair trade learning is community-driven. That's a central commitment. And that means that learning, service, planning, representation, how programs are marketed, evaluation, iterative improvements, adjustments, they're all done in partnership. And there are many different guidelines in the standards relating to that. I've been trying to boil things down to central commitments, so that's clearly one. Another is caring credibly, which means being informed about challenging areas where sometimes our instincts to care aren't necessarily aligned with good practice. And we'll talk a bit more about, Ethan just mentioned orphanage tourism, also the pre-professional medical international service area, are rife with risk. So how are we caring in a way that's credible in terms of ensuring support and protection for vulnerable populations in particular? So fair trade learning is community-driven, caring credibly, and capital conscious, which means that there's financial transparency embedded in partnership with the community, including deliberate efforts to enhance equity and ensure just remuneration in terms of homestays, community educators, and people on the community side are part of the partnership. And finally, it's connecting. So making sure that facilitated growth opportunities exist for everyone involved, all stakeholders, community members, students, to leverage the experience toward lifelong global civil society and global citizenship commitments. So making sure that these aren't, that those of us in educator and stakeholder positions do all that we can to ensure that these are high growth opportunities that point toward continuous learning, reflection, connecting opportunities for all people involved to really build a better set of communities and world that kind of matches the rhetoric that we often put out there. So those are the key commitments. We all operate within some rather significant pressures. And I do want to mention here this little graphic. I'm going to share the representation of it, share with me from someone in a study abroad, education abroad office. I've actually used it also with nonprofits, and as Ethan mentioned, I used to direct a nonprofit. But many of us feel similar sets of pressures in this area. So in the education abroad office case, the sector has been increasing over the last several decades, so has the focus on high quality. And then add to that this growing interest in service learning placements and service learning's historic focus on reciprocity, as well as the mandate to do no harm when working with communities and vulnerable populations. And we see in the broad office one part of the university engaged in a very delicate dance with diverse stakeholders. Similarly, if you put the nonprofit organization or the study abroad provider in that squeezed position, there is this right side set of concerns around, if you're looking at the screen on the right, safety, academic quality, reciprocity, ethics, standards, that I know that excellent providers are very deeply focused on, and they get a profound amount of pressure from the left side relating to cost and logistics and a whole set of things that maybe are not the things that bring them into the work from a passion perspective. So this desire to have ethics is squeezed out and squeezed out again and again in the sector, and really a huge part of the reason for the development of fair trade learning was creating a space to articulate that we have to maintain ethics despite the pressures we interact with. And our aim with fair trade learning is to create that resource to offer to people who are doing work in these challenging spaces and move multi-stakeholder dialogue and partnership forward in productive ways. Apologies for those of you who are very familiar with service learning. I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. So this comes from Andrew Furco's work with the Corporation for National Community Service, and provides a helpful reminder that any engagement with community, whether it's called service learning or participatory methods or engaged learning, requires intentionality with respect to both community and student benefit. And honestly, for me, you know, there's some suggestion I'm involved with service learning, whether it's service learning, learning service, community engagement, the set of principles that are incredibly important remain extremely similar, if not the same, and they focus around ensuring that community is as important in terms of outcomes as students. And that's the core assumption of fair trade learning, that program design, development, delivery, and evaluation continuously consider community and student outcomes, and that the partnership is always a co-creative process in terms of working with the community.
Eric, if I could interrupt for just a second, there's a couple comments that seem relevant.
Sure, please.
One is career services. This is sort of almost to the 2 slides ago where that pinch is felt, but career services have rules, and this is sort of a frustration, that they will not support fee-based internships, but how do they expect to place students in vulnerable populations abroad without charging a fee? So that's just a pinch that's been expressed.
Right, that is a really important pinch. And actually, I should mention that, you know, the information I'll be providing throughout keeps focusing back to globalsl.org, but also I don't know if I've put my email up, but I'm definitely happy to get emails on these kinds of issues and connect and see if we could connect with other resources at other institutions where there may be other examples. Because sometimes sometimes institutions do best by looking at other models, and sometimes speaking with experts. So in the field of public health in particular, Jessica Everett, a colleague, has done a profound amount of great work on pre-professional medical interventions, and it just becomes crystal clear that our students are in a, I'll speak more about this, but our students are in locations where they can be doing significant harm and really at risk themselves in some ways. And our institutions are also liable in those locations. So these are things we need to find ways around, and that's a very great example of a pinch. Are there any other things that came up, Ethan?
Just some shared praise about Jessica, and which I think anyone who knows her can also echo, and right. Then just an introduction for why someone is interested in the fair trade learning rubric.
Great.
So yeah.
Okay. Well, so I was talking a bit about co-creation, and co-creation goes well beyond considering outcomes in the case of both community members and students. The principles themselves grow from different kinds of pushback by a small community organization in rural Jamaica, the Association of Clubs. So the Association of Clubs, some of their members are pictured on the left here, and they're actually teaching some visitors about facilitation in that particular context. But the Association of Clubs really pushed on the organization I directed in the past and taught me and many others a great deal about cooperative partnership. They actually worked with 2 different study abroad organizations before they found one that was willing to embrace what they felt embodied full partnership. And if one of the directors of the Association of Clubs were here presenting with me, and we've presented together many times, he would say, we brought these other organizations in and they brought young people that were only interested in the 3 S's, sun, sand, and he always says, you guessed the last one. But they didn't appreciate the kind of spring break ethos that many of the visitors were bringing to their community, and they preferred to have an environment that they felt was supportive for the young people in their community. So they kicked the other organizations out, and years later partnered with Amazaji Global Service Learning, where I'm still on the board. It's one of numerous organizations and institutions that are now using fair trade learning to guide partnerships. And the AOC, the Association of Clubs, got us started by insisting that budgeting for homestays should be transparent and should deliberately support community economic development. And they further insisted that local community youth should have financially supported opportunities to participate both in courses offered locally and in exchange programs that would allow them to visit the campuses and communities of visiting schools and universities. So the fair trade learning standards, when I say include transparency around economic issues, the budgeting there is genuinely participatory, and that contrasts to a situation where in conventional, genuinely participatory, and the homestays are in a revolving house mother network. It's very systematic about ensuring that the funds are distributed throughout the community, and there's actually a community savings portion captured by all the homestay mothers that's reinvested into particular community initiatives at different times. And in Jamaica, that contrasts very starkly with an environment where the UN World Tourism Organization estimated several years ago that in developing country communities, the average percentage of funds that stayed in the global south when tourists visited in the small communities was 5%. And in this case, it's about 70%, and a lot of that is due to international airfare. So you see in a typical model, and sometimes you see this with study abroad organizations, a purchase of land. I've even seen this with organizations that claim to be supporting sustainable development, a purchase of land in a country in the global south that's actually been owned in the north, where students are housed on a particular property. Universities do this regularly. And what happens there is the footprint of ownership from the north just grows into the south, and the community is not part of a co-development process. So this particular community very systematically leverages funds from visitors to spread wealth around and throughout the community. So the principles emerged from a community-articulated vision of what partnerships should embody. Before I move on, I should just mention they also pushed quite hard on the issue of local community youth participation. They said in almost precisely these words, your students get to say they supported community development in Jamaica. What do our students say that they hung out with white people for a couple of weeks? So you can see that kind of commentary is reflective of a long-standing relationship through which trust grows, and long-standing collaboration is an important element here. So they grew out of that particular situation, but since then a broad network of community organizations, non-governmental organizations, and universities have continued to advance fair trade learning in the decade plus since, and it's really been more than a decade since those pushes started to come from the Association of Clubs, but only in the last, several years have we started to really move out and collaborate across institutions and organizations, and to systematically document what we've learned from that partnership and spread it elsewhere. And so we've developed and advanced fair trade learning as a strategy for reciprocity. We also had the opportunity to work not only with Dr. Everett, who I mentioned earlier, and others concerned with challenges in pre-professional public health, but also began collaborating with a global coalition of more than 40 child well-being organizations that comprise the Better Volunteering, Better Care Network. So that network advocates against orphanage tourism, something that Ethan mentioned earlier, for a host of very good research-based reasons relating to ensuring maximum opportunities for children around the world. So fair trade learning has also come to embrace clear language around ensuring protection for all vulnerable populations, because just to underline the point here, the evidence is crystal clear that good intentions sometimes and maybe even often harm communities, particularly in the case of pre-professional health interventions and orphanage tourism. There's also evidence that this work can be done well, but it does require an extraordinary amount of intentionality, listening, and co-leadership, hence the reasons for the standards. So just to do a degree of summarizing here, we see ourselves positioned in a sector that's a $2.8 billion sector. The youth travel and tourism market is a $173 billion global marketplace. Within that youth travel and tourism global marketplace, the highest growing areas are higher education and international service and volunteering. So that's a $2.8 billion sector, creating a number of perverse incentives. Or incentives for organizations that don't know anything about community development to enter the fray, so to speak. Communities partner for mutual development, so we'll see students saying they had an excellent experience and communities saying they'd like something more and clearly. And we've seen clear harms from pre-professional health interventions and orphanage tourism. So that led us to this space where we've had this multi-institutional, multi-organizational dialogue to create the standard set as they currently exist. So just wanted to see at this point, before I jump into the actual standards, if anyone has any questions or comments, concerns, or burning issues.
No fires that require putting out, burning or otherwise at this point, Eric, though please don't be shy in typing any questions out as they arrive to all the attendees.
Okay, great. Thank you. So there is a fair trade learning rubric that I'm going to share examples from the rubric in a second. We actually have several different outcomes, and we're working on many different mechanisms to just move this conversation along. So that's a heavily wordy side, so I'm just going to go back for a second. So first we had a standard set. The standard set is rather long. It's available on a website I'll share in just a moment, and it's published in a journal from Sage Publications, and fortunately they've made that a freely accessible article. So the standard set is fully accessible, but it's a lot of reading, and honestly the journal article came before we integrated the public health and orphanage tourism pieces, so that's missing from that particular publication. There's also a rubric, which I'll show some examples from. It's really designed to move along conversation. So study abroad offices, working with service learning offices, with community partners, with administration. How do you responsibly engage this conversation? And how do you look at everything? There's so many moving parts in these particular areas. That's why we developed the rubric, and hopefully it really supports people moving forward in that area. And then finally, I have 12 questions that are designed to try to get sort of down to the 12 essential elements. And the rubric also works across those 12. So we see here the first of the 12 questions. The first question: do stakeholders, including several and diverse community members, agree on long-term mutuality of goals and aspirations? Now, to show you how the rubric works, here's an example of the discussion rubric for question 1. And what we tried to do here was, if you see on the right side of your screen, there's a way that often these kinds of partnerships are entered, and then on the far left is an articulation of what those of us in the coalition work here suggest is an ideal situation. And what we've seen happen in some partnerships is that particular offices or the community organization or individuals involved will will be asked to circle where they think the partnership is. Is it simply a connection between some existing relationship that facilitates immersive exchange and service on the one side at sort of entry level, or is there an agreement upon long-term mutuality of goals and aspirations? Are there multiple stakeholders involved? You see an asterisk in the, I cut this from the larger rubric, but you see an asterisk on the word service. In my own work, we've defined that very capaciously. What the community suggests is their interest is service, as long as it's not at odds with vulnerable populations. So, for example, in the Navajo Nation, where and I talk about global learning actually, so that can happen domestically. In the Navajo Nation, where I've worked with some organizations for some time, they articulate that service would be visitors listening to them, learning about their history, learning about their story, learning about different moments in U.S. history, the Navajo's time at Bosque Redondo, how they were moved back to the current reservation. So learning as service is what they really articulate there, and they ask people who are visitors to share their stories back in their home communities when they return home. And that's an example of multiple stakeholders in a community working with the organization that is bringing colleges and universities, which in turn has to often educate directors of offices about how the service might be learning rather than conventional forms of building things, because that's a situation where the community members will say very clearly that they've had enough people come through and attempt to put doors on their traditional hogans, which don't have doors. So there's a kind of a resistance to conventional forms there. So in any case, talking through this rubric.
Eric, can I interrupt with a question?
Yes.
Great. I did want to ask, so to get your thoughts on which members in the community sort of are we asking their opinions for. That itself is a rabbit hole that you may not want to get into, but how does that census take place? How have you seen that successfully come to agreement? You're working through one NGO, you're working through an individual. Who do you census? Those kinds of questions.
Right. And I don't think I have a perfect response here. Across the rubric, and so we're seeing one indicator right here, and there are 12 different indicators, and I think a common theme moving across several of those indicators is that we're moving from, usually, in so many instances, entry happens through an individual or an organization. A good relationship over time in this context of community partnership should not be threatened by triangulating relationships in the community. And so triangulating and beyond, but working to have multiple relationships within the NGO, beyond the NGO, and with people in the community who are not directly involved in the NGO. We do articulate continuous effort to move outward from certainly having one particular relationship is problematic in many different ways. And so that's one of the indicators of good practice. And one thing that's really, what these fair trade learning indicators do, I think in so many ways, is just call us to return to the importance of issues like that and be intentional in how we work through them. So I may not have a perfect answer, but I think the guidelines would push us to continuously engage the process of reaching beyond this single, I would call it, bottlenecking type of relationship. So a second question, do all stakeholders understand the nature of partnership commitments, including whether the partnership is ongoing or time-bound, and under what conditions or process it might end? In many partnerships, just the importance of clarity of expectations is what comes through here. And unfortunately, there are many instances of particularly universities what I'm familiar with, people will reasonably see or perceive that universities have a fair bit of wealth and power and get the sense that they're continuing in communities. And the expectation should be clear from the outset. And something that's very important here is to communicate across the university stakeholders about this issue. We see in the research coming out of Nora Reynolds' research in Nicaragua, it's just in the Michigan Journal, while the director of service learning, for example, may have a clear sense of this, and their relationship with the NGO might be quite clear between even quite distant countries, if a professor of public health or nursing or engineering goes down and offhandedly says, yeah, that'd be great. It'd be great if the university could do that in a couple of years. That can very much be perceived as a promise. So making sure this is something that's discussed across stakeholders. And I would just add to that that there can be instances where partnerships don't necessarily proceed indefinitely. There are often rationales for that, and as long as everyone's clear in communicating about that, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. Do community members have clear teaching and leadership roles, as well as clear roles in driving research direction, process, and publication with fair authorship rights? So here again, we actually see a parallel example regarding the one community member to thinking about systematically engaging across community members in this particular area. So usually there's a key access facilitator in the beginning. Remunerating speaking and leadership roles, it's very important, and you see that in domestic as well as international service learning, as we offer professionals and faculty fees for their expertise. If we have someone who can tell us the story of the sugar industry in rural Jamaica, we should also be, and that person's work in unionizing and community organization, we should also be remunerating that person for their leadership. Community members, you see this in service learning domestically and internationally. Community members, particularly those who are involved in social movements, are often very passionate about educating young people. So as we get to more advanced and ideal, that the content of programming, thought regarding educational direction, of course the community-driven development, but also the construction of learning goals and how that relates to why these community members want outsiders in their community is something to continue to advance. And then, moving into ideal, that's just continuously more systematic and also may lead to co-publication, things like that, particularly in the context of university partnerships. So a fourth question, are vulnerable populations such as children clearly protected through appropriate safeguards and relevant training for all individuals involved in the partnership? If anybody has any questions later, I can talk about and represent the work of the UNICEF and Save the Children led building, Better Volunteering, Better Care initiative. But the issue here repeatedly is it can be quite difficult to really spot high-risk situations, unnecessary high-risk situations for children and for people who are seeking medical care. So that's an incredibly important criteria that we're seeing come up again and again. Do students, same-age peers from the community, have financially underwritten opportunities to participate in programming? This seems like it's necessarily incredibly expensive. It doesn't have to be. So there are more and less affordable ways to do this. For example, more affordably, if there are visitors present in the community somewhat regularly, and they're learning about, I was speaking about the Navajo Nation some time ago, I'll use that example. So visitors come and learn about the Navajo Nation, and the community has even identified, or several community members, I should say more carefully, thanks to that good question earlier, several community members have repeatedly said We want outsiders to learn about our tradition, our cultural history. This 18, 19, 20, traditional college age and high school age Navajo or Diné people certainly don't tend to know as much as their elders do about Navajo traditions or Diné traditions. So when a course is already taking place there, one of the more affordable ways to include local youth is to allow them to audit. Now, ideally, I think they would get accredited recognition for their presence. That's still relatively affordable in the grand scheme of things here because they're not necessarily needing to travel like the rest of the students are. But we do see, I think, the best practice examples actually give people from host communities access to travel to other communities and do service learning across cultures. And we've seen some institutions build that into programming or be quite systematic about building partnerships. I'm thinking of Cornell University right now has a partnership in public health with a medical college in Tanzania. And there the students work on teams, the Tanzanian students and the U.S. students work on teams to develop public health, both research and kind of strategy papers on moving forward addressing particular issues. And an equal number of participants on either side. In that case, the Tanzanians aren't traveling, so that's more affordable, but they're still doing accredited learning in their institution, in their environment for their careers, and supporting the capacity of those communities very much as a result. So in terms of community impact, are the reasons for the partnership understood and embraced by multiple and diverse stakeholders? There's the individual question again. In terms of student learning, are the reasons for the partnership understood and embraced by multiple and diverse stakeholders? And we say those questions very similarly, but differently to point to there's just always there's at least two dominant sort of theories of change or units of change involved in this work. One is the idea that there's community development change. The other is student development change. Do recruitment and other outreach materials serve an educative function, shaping expectations for ethical engagement? This is one of my favorites, in a way, to work with and look at. I think it's so important and compelling. So at entry level, and still an opportunity to see a lot of this is if one Googles international service or international volunteering opportunities. Recruitment materials reproduce stereotypical and simplistic portrayals of community members. We all know that there's a great diversity of wealth and resources around the world. We can know that empirically through traveling, we can know it through data, we can know it all sorts of different ways, but unfortunately in the sector that we work within, there's a frequent reproduction of a particular kind of neediness, and a particular kind of savior type of elevation. Marketing materials or recruitment materials are the first chance that organizations and institutions have to really start to shape perceptions and introduce young people to what is ultimately a more accurate view of the world, and that is one in which there are resources everywhere and strong people everywhere. So the ideal there, recruitment materials serve an educative function, shaping expectations for ethical engagement, partnership, etc. Asset-based community development. Ethan mentioned I edit the website globalsl.org. I'm not going to suggest this is easy. We've got 5 pictures that rotate through our website, and we work with a network of universities, and we looked through thousands of pictures before we settled on the 5 we had, and they're not perfect. They could be critiqued. I'm not suggesting they're perfect. I think the Foundation for Sustainable Development, which has a really strong asset-based approach to its work, does a nice job with its representation. I'm not on the board there or anything like that. Just work with them. So do all stakeholders know whom to communicate with about what, through what channels at all times? Again, just quite important. And this also coming from that realization earned through a lot of practice, but also you see it backed up in data on domestic and international service learning partnership. Community members often may have a sense that talking to someone at the university is good enough. And of course, those of us in universities often don't even think we can communicate within our own university. So making sure that there's a strategy for collecting information and sharing information back out is very important. I know we're kind of cruising along here in time, but I just wanted to be sure to, there's just a couple of more questions. I wanted to see if anyone had any comments or questions at the moment before I do those last few.
A well-timed slide, Eric. Yeah. One question came up from, I think a couple slides ago, might be bullet point number 4 if I'm recalling correctly, but can you give an example of high-risk children situation?
Sure. So the Better Volunteering, Better Care initiative came about because, first of all, it was really advanced fundamentally from the perspective of people who spend their lives and careers dedicated to child rights, child protection, and child well-being. So the professional sector that works with organizations like UNICEF and Save the Children. Decades ago, those organizations really started to work hard to deinstitutionalize children from orphanages because the research was showing again and again that all things being equal, whether it's a poor country or a wealthy country or somewhere in between, if a family network can be engaged, a foster care network can be engaged, and these things happen in countries that are relatively economically poor. There are foster networks, there are family networks, cousins, etc., uncles. So when that can be engaged, it's always better for child's development. Orphanages are a worst-case scenario. Institutional care is a worst-case scenario for child's development. So they had been working for many years to deinstitutionalize orphanages, and so effectively that currently governments and major international foundations don't fund orphanages. They don't fund. They certainly don't fund orphanages in which short-term volunteers could volunteer. So while that has been happening, there's also been a surge in our particular sector. Remember the $2.8 billion international volunteer tourism sector. And we're seeing an increase in orphanages all around the world that is actually not correlated with an increase in orphans, but is correlated with tourists. So where there are more tourists in Nepal and Cambodia, the particular districts that are tourist heavy have more orphanages than the districts that are even population heavy. So you're seeing what's happening here. Orphanages aren't good for children. They should be a last case resort. We're seeing a growth in the number of orphanages. It seems to correlate with the influx of cash that comes from people trying to do good. And the issue here is, well, there's really two things going on. One is there are documented cases of simply really nefarious people taking advantage of the system and duping people on both ends, meaning they trick people in rural communities to send their children to something they'll say is a boarding school, and then they'll trick tourists into thinking the children are without families and in need and need their service time and their donations. And there's documented cases of that, and the U.S. Department of State has added warnings about this to their human rights document in Nepal, and there's also documented cases about that in Cambodia. And that's the most nefarious of the two. The other thing that happens is there's just more money pouring into this area, and for people who are essentially trying to do well by children, it becomes easier to have an orphanage than maybe to set up a foster network. But again, we know that orphanages are worse for children, even in the best cases. And finally, on top of that set of issues, so the children that are in the orphanages tend to be vulnerable, and we're setting up a situation where they're visited for a week, 2 weeks, maybe 8 weeks at a time, and those people repeatedly leave. So again, through research base, there's evidence of development of severe attachment issues for the children. So that's why UNICEF Save the Children and these, it's now 50 plus child protection organizations and other organizations concerned with international volunteering ethics advocate against orphanage tourism. Sorry, this is a little long. I want to make sure to give the issue its fair treatment, and I'll just close by mentioning, of course, well, two things. One, in this discussion, it's all too common, and I've been part of it, and lots of people I know and love have been part of it. That is, everybody has their orphanage. Right? So many of us have seen an orphanage that seems to be helping, and it's hard to see the place where the kids might otherwise be. There are networks all around the world that are working to deinstitutionalize. In Latin America, there's something called RELAF. If anybody wants information on any of this, I'm happy to send it. I don't remember if I ever got my email out earlier. I was trying to share it. It's Hartman, EHARTMAN @ksu.edu. But in any case, so that's one issue. Even though this issue can be laid out pretty well, so many of us have connected somewhere well with an organization and think, well, that one will be okay. And what the child well-being research says that that's incredibly unlikely. And then the final piece is, well, people say, well, what if it really is a child that can't be placed? That does happen occasionally. And there are some orphanages that exist right now in Nepal, for example, and work to protect children to the best extent possible and with the best staffing possible. It's hard to imagine a case where that last resort orphanage, best practice orphanage exists and would permit 1, 2, or even 8-week unqualified volunteers, meaning people who aren't trained to work with vulnerable children, to be present and work. I'll just close on that by saying this is uncomfortable, I know, for a lot of people, but if anybody's curious about that data or anything else, I'm happy to share and represent it. It's something I've been working with a few years now. Did any other questions or comments come in as I was sharing about that, Ethan?
Yeah, and I mean, it's quite the mouthful, and I just really appreciate you being so willing to dive into what is inevitably such a sticky situation. And of course, sort of the pioneering efforts of those that are on the front line trying to come up with real alternatives. Another question did come in, and it goes, I definitely understand and agree with the overall premise of the guidelines on marketing and recruitment materials. What would you say is the balance between the amount of time, in parentheses, money, salaries, etc., that could be spent selecting the right photos versus being able to put more money towards community programs in action?
Right. It's a great question, and they're mutually reinforcing too, I think, because if that sort of right programming and action is happening, then people involved should be less likely to take these sorts of poses that show up so many places, and/or there should be more good photos to take. All of these issues aren't fundamentally either-ors, and I guess I thought the question was going to a related space I want to comment on, and I think it is related enough. I hope it's related enough for who asked it. So I'm at a new institution. It's a great institution in a bazillion ways. It's also under by way of the data, underperforming in international engagement by undergraduates. And by that I mean, if we want to be in a similar space as our peer institutions, we'd have more undergraduates going abroad. So I'm working hard to recruit in an environment where the assumption is not that everyone will go abroad. That exists at some universities, as you all well know, does not exist at most universities. And I had a small program this past summer, and it was definitely a building type of year. I guess what I'm sharing is I felt the kind of sacrifice that comes along from working hard to do ethical building from the outset. I think it can be a little bit slower sometimes. But we are seeing quite clearly it can be worse to go recklessly than to go small and systematically. So these are balances and tensions we have to strike. And that's actually part of the reason there's the developmental rubric. So show those examples of taking on different rubric discussions for 12 different questions. I'm showing one at a time for a lot of different reasons, but looking with your stakeholders across your partnership at all 12 at once is exhausting. No one would ever want to do that. But there's a sense that a lot of people want to do so well with these partnerships, and I recommend even just looking at one once a month, looking at one a month, for example, for a whole year would be a slow but important dialogue process. No, I went around a little bit on that question. I hope it was helpful. We all work in a lot of tension in this space and work hard to do it well, and that's what the standards hope to support. So last three questions that we have. For all interested community members and students, does carefully selected text and facilitated discussion support learning about responsible engagement, cross-cultural cooperation, and growth in global community before, during, and after campus community campus engagements? That's so important for us. That's this work to grow global citizenship, putting air quotes up there right now, to grow global learning, to grow global, grow cosmopolitan thinking, intercultural capacities, communication capacities. Those who spend a good amount of time in the field of international education know that all of those things require systematic pre, during, and post-reflective processing. So how is all that packaged across to work to do not only that, but I think an under-realized opportunity for the global civic development space is the post-programming and really working to get participants to grow their own capacities to make these lifelong habits. Certainly we don't want them to be one-and-done experiences. Is the economic impact of the partnership deliberately distributed among multiple stakeholders, such as community organization buildings where classroom space is secured, local restaurants that host students and community partners, and/or host families working with overnight programs? If your student group regularly visits, or a group of young people regularly visits rural communities in Guatemala or Tanzania or Ghana, Bolivia, etc., that's a considerable economic influx for homestays, whatever you're doing, hostel stays. You have a group of 15 students and you're paying $20 a night for housing somewhere, you may well be above per capita income in some countries in the global south. And that's in one night. So being very systematic about that's profoundly important. Do all stakeholders have access to information regarding financial commitments and disbursements that support the partnership, along with opportunities to openly and critically discuss those commitments with other stakeholders? So I've shared a little bit of this coming out of Jamaica. I also should mention the dissertation work of Cynthia Toms, who's now the Director of Global Engagement at Westmont College in California. She, for her dissertation, went and did qualitative interviewing and focus groups with 3 different communities in Costa Rica, each of which had partnered with different organizations from the north. And the common themes that came out of her interviews, there were 3. One was either in an established way or in an informal way, the women in the community were reinvesting some of the homestay funds into a kind of a community savings or kitty or investment bank, similar to Jamaica site actually. But in 2 of those communities it was happening informally rather than in an established way, but it was still happening. Another was that people in the community generally did not know who set homestay rates, or how, or what the procedure was, or who they would appeal to if they wanted to raise the rates. I should mention, in the context of the Jamaica partnership, I was executive director at the time of that first push, and I didn't think the market would bear the increase that the homestay families wanted, and I made that very clear to them. I was entirely unconvinced that they should raise their rates. And they did anyway, for the set of reasons that they put forward. They're an island economy, etc. And I was wrong, and they were right. They took the risk, though. That's the thing about participatory budgeting. But in the case of these particular families in Costa Rica, many of them thought they should raise rates, but they didn't even know who they would necessarily connect to. And finally, there was a third piece. That was that in terms of preparation, the organizations in the north were saying that the communities were preparing students when they got there, doing an orientation, and the communities thought the organizations in the north were doing. So it was a real example of a lot of systematic lack of understanding throughout the partnerships examined there. And so finally, and I will in a moment see if there are any questions or discussion people would like to have. We've got a little bit more time here if we want it. If we don't, that's okay too. But I hope I made clear how the key commitments here are being community-driven, understanding how to care credibly, being capital conscious, and connecting. And there are some more resources available. The University of Kentucky's made a faculty toolkit for this to integrate, or a faculty toolkit resource, I should say. They have a really good toolkit. But that resource helps faculty, staff, and students integrate fair trade learning discussion into any partnership or program. The summary and key documents that I talked about today are available at globalsl.org/FTL. I just wanted to invite you all to be part of the discussion community. I've shared my email already, but we're on Twitter at BuildingBetterW and on Facebook at GlobalSL, and you can get email updates from GlobalSL as well. So thank you so much for being here. I do hope we continue to connect, and I'd love to see if there's any questions or comments at the moment.
Sure. Yeah. No, thank you again, Eric. It's worth saying that the fair trade learning standards are things that I'm trying to work to get into the AGA, the gap year standards, largely to replace our existing service standards. And just because I think it's a miraculous and fairly well thought out system. It's certainly the best that I've seen. So again, Eric, thank you so much for the time. I do have a few questions that are showing up, so I'll dive into those. But Eric, do you have any resources for online courses that support fair trade learning? Something that maybe could be used pre-departure, for instance.
Was that a question coming from the
audience? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the desires for a course or a pre-program kind of seminar on fair trade learning for people before they go?
Yeah, do you know of any resources or courses that are available?
Yeah, I don't. And that's the kind of thing we'd be absolutely willing to figure out building together. I mentioned globalsl.org. I think it has a similar heart and ethos to what I understand of AGA and BBC, and that is that we're just working to cooperate across institutions to figure out how to get everybody the resources to do this better. So whoever said that, if you want to figure out something to do together, we could probably figure it out. But I'm not aware of anything right now. The other thing I wanted to mention that I should have just embedded somewhere in the presentation, but it's been a really important insight for me. I heard back from just an elite institution. I won't name, but trust me, it's an elite institution in the U.S. Some of their leadership really supported the idea, but it's not always easy to get things across. Get people to take on new ideas simply because they're ethical, for example. But what they saw was that their students were critiquing their programs based on lack of deep interaction with community members. And they realized that the Fair Trade Learning Standards were a vehicle to improve their programs, to improve the student experience of their programs, because students who participate in programs that are fair trade lending programs are actually participating in deeper cooperative development, whereas students who are coming through without this kind of depth of thinking might just be subject to some of those critiques we see out there about voyeuristic experiences, etc. That was an insight for me, the idea that this also deeply improves the student connection experience and communities. It makes total sense, but it wasn't what drove me to it. So I appreciated hearing that. And I thought this might help some of you justify it on your campuses as well, or in your organizations.
It's an interesting idea, Eric, and one that I've actually seen used on one occasion. An organization sort of empowered the students to be part of the assessment process, of course, with some training. And I can't remember if they actually used the Fair Trade Learning Standards themselves as the framework or even as the template, but it seemed a good way to go about it. Ryan Richards did mention that ServSmart does have an Impact Abroad toolkit that's this type of course, and that can be found at serve-smart.com/toolkit, he says. Also, Om Prakash has one, and the author of the question says that they're not sure if is it fair trade or not. That's a question mark. But that's it. Any other questions before? There is one other one that I'd like to dive into too, Eric, in terms of the media and the marketing, because I think it is one of those, another pinch point for sure, where I've heard organizations say maybe if they're headquartered overseas, I can't use a word like service because it means something different in my culture. And so wanting to, however, have a web presence that's global, and so, they used a word like help, but help means something very different. There's an implied power differential with such terminology, at least in the stateside, and for those that are aware. And I'm just curious to dive back in maybe ever so briefly into the media piece, Eric, if you have any suggestions around language or maybe sort of what kinds of barometers might be good uses for an organization to help decide, gosh, is this sort of a fair representation? What's the story that's within the, that this picture is telling? I really did like on globalsl.org how you can actually, on the photo that's there, you can click a toggle that says about this photo to explain the context of the photo rather than just letting the photo sort of fill in whatever blanks might be had for the viewer.
Right. Well, you've hit on a good point there at the end. Thanks for that. And that is these, actually the photo we're looking at right now, I didn't take it. A colleague and friend shared it with me when I asked for good photos, and I said, that doesn't look like a good photo to me. It looks like these visitors are leading something, and the community member, and he said, no, it's your assumptions that are wrong here. The community members are teaching those visitors to facilitate something, and I've used it. It reminds me of the importance of context. So having context on the photos or ways that you're able to explain the photos, I think, can be an important move. Sharing the photos with community members and community partners and having discussions about how they wish to be represented and represent themselves, and doing so in a way that involves a diversity of power holders within the community is really important. The pressures are felt in so many different ways in all this work, and I'm quite aware that some community organizations or community members start to see the opportunities that can come along with international volunteers and get really profoundly supportive of lots of guests coming through, almost no matter what. And clearly in this kind of dialogue, there are always different perspectives within the community, and having that broad stakeholder knowledge to know where the skeptics are and see what they would have to say about them is important. I was trying to think about that particular issue you brought up, Ethan. I think it's an important issue online. In the context of so many schools and universities, we probably can deal with our own English, right, and our own cultural assumptions, whatever that is, around these kinds of words. And so I was trying to think of where that would really be a pinch point. And I'm guessing it's in terms of online marketing. If organization based in Europe is saying a set of things that's also going to be projected in the U.S. Is that where you're seeing this come up?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. In the UK, using terms like service learning, just they're not only not as common, but service. Whereas here you say service in the States, and it has dual meanings, both sort of military service, but also sort of volunteering ethics, or or movements, I guess. There, what I'm told is that service really is far more strongly associated with military service, and they didn't feel comfortable having that word in their dialogue, and so chose the word help, and that was an interesting conversation.
Right, right. Yeah, I guess two things are coming to mind for me at the moment. One, uh, Europe has a little bit more established thinking, I would argue, than we do on development studies in general. So I think there might be a space to go for with something like cooperative development there. But the other thing that strikes me is, or that I'm reminded of, in some of these conversations, it's important to remember we can use marketing as a shoot, I'm forgetting the exact term, but as the first sifting mechanism. So not necessarily working to cast an ever broader net, but maybe working to get people who are really going to be supportive of careful, cooperative, conscientious partnership into programs. In the sector, as we see a lot of growth, there's a strong temptation to work to keep growing, but it really depends on what we're trying to advance, whether we appeal to masses or we appeal to a kind of populations is looking for something particularly special and connected. So yeah, I think these are individualized cases and conversations, but that's a tough one you bring forward, and maybe looking through that particular standard would be helpful there, though it sounds like you've already had a good bit of conversation.
Yeah, a fair bit of conversation for sure. But Eric, one of the things that I like about the fair trade learning standards as they're written is that it's iterative. It's not sort of right wrong, but let's look at it on a continuum. And as much as we can be sort of engaged and involving, inclusive, that seems like sort of that's sort of the goal in many ways. One final question before we wrap up, if I may, Eric. Is there a market for
Sure.
the deep
And actually, before that, I should just jump back in since both ServSmart and Oberkosh were mentioned, which are both great programs. And I'm sorry I didn't mention them when someone talked about fair trade learning in particular. Occasionally I'm too academic, and so I was trying to identify something that was exclusively dedicated to fair trade learning. And those are both excellent ways to prepare volunteers to be more thoughtful, or service learning students, people who are about to engage these kinds of environments to be more thoughtful in the ways in which they engage them. So preparation for individuals before they go, and they both get at some of these pieces of fair trade learning standards along the way.
Gotcha. That final question. Is there a market for the deep reflective student when literacy is going down and education is less focused on critical thinking? I'm thinking this is relevant to low to middle income countries where a student might offer some sort of skills training or something. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Wait, is that your interpretation of the question was different from how I understood that question?
Oh, so, great. Take yours.
I thought the question was about whether it's actually possible to sell a program to a special kind of student who really wants an engaged experience. Given that in our own country there's less literacy and slowness of thinking and things of that nature. Was that right, or is it?
They're confirming what I'm interpreting as my interpretation, though I think yours is also a good one.
Great. Okay, so can you ask me again what the question really is?
Sure, yeah. Is there a market for that deep reflective student when literacy is going down and education is less focused on critical thinking? A point of explanation. I see a gap widening, and more universities charge money but don't provide quality. I'm still confused on the question.
Yeah. So, well, I'll just go ahead with what I think we're talking about. And if more explanation comes in, wonderful. I keep connecting with students who do get wise to the insufficiencies of the current market pretty swiftly. And I've actually seen and worked with, in fact, years ago I interviewed with an organization to have an administrative position I ultimately didn't take, which involved really helping a strong established, a broad organization move more so into the service learning, civic engagement marketplace. And one of the hang-ups they were having at the time was that they had a program in East Africa, but the students just weren't giving it strong reviews. And I asked them in the interview, well, is it a community-driven development program, or is it something that you already had a location in East Africa where you were involved with Serengeti tours and things of that nature, and you added on service learning because it's a growing marketplace? And you can see right away that the executive recognized the reality of that critique, and that they had just connected the idea of service with travel. And they weren't community development people, and they weren't community development experts, etc. And so in that environment, it was no surprise to me that the students were going and not reporting well on the experience. And there's a middle space here. There's an unfortunately large middle. So I think sometimes poor programming just doesn't work because students, despite all the maybe issues people may see with current generations and people always being on their phones or only communicating in 140 characters or etc., there's a deep desire for authentic connection. That's always there. It's coming through. See it in the way students are engaging civically, and when they're good at spotting, and some students come back and are very critical of the kinds of things they've entered. I'm getting more and more students connecting and say, how do we spread fair trade learning? And it's something I'm excited about because I think there's an authenticity to it that really helps address some of the issues they all struggle with. I mean, they don't want to be sold the idea of doing good when it's not an authentic good. And they're increasingly critical that might be happening. So I think there's an appetite for the authenticity of deep connection that comes with doing the work well, and even with understanding some of the patience that might require. And again, it's a tension and a battle, but I see more and more people aligned with willingness to do it, young people, old people, and all in between.
Well said. Yeah. No, that's very helpful, Eric, and thank you again very much. We have just another 8 minutes or so left in the scheduled webinar time, and if there's more questions, please feel free to launch in. But otherwise, what I will say is that reminder, this webinar is recorded, so you should receive an automatic email tomorrow, actually 24 hours from today, that has a link to the actual webinar. As well, the Fair Trade Service Learning rubric is available as a download right now on your handouts toggle of the GoToWebinar control panel. So if you haven't already taken a look at the full file, it should be available for download right there. And in anything else, really look forward to hearing Eric, hopefully on the stage. Eric, are you doing any conferences, presentations in the next few months?
International Association of Research on Service Learning and Civic Engagement.
Great. Fantastic. And where is that and when?
That's in Boston.
Fantastic.
in November. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
And American Association or Association of American Colleges and Universities in October, they're doing a global learning conference. We're talking there in October.
Great.
Thank you again, Ethan and Ryan and everyone who did the organizing and participating today. And I really do hope to hear from some of you who have been on the call about ideas or opportunities or anything at all that might support moving forward greater awareness regarding some of these issues. We, I'll just to summarize or close, we see in study abroad, service learning, and education, and among our students, so many people who want to do well and really support improvements in communities and around the world. Too often this conversation, if you look at it online, gets really crassly dichotomized. You either cannot do good international service, it's necessarily paternalistic and colonialistic and everything else, or it's all good, and it's wonderful, and people are smiling with babies, etc. There's an in-between space. We talked about some of the critiques today. You may have heard within everything I said an assumption of mine that can be done well. That's also borne out in research. We see evidence from communities that community development projects can advance, but even more important sometimes are the linkages that develop, the civil society networks that grow, and the kinds of advocacy and behavior adaptations that come relating to human rights and gender equity norms and things of that nature. So it's really important work, I think, and quite possible to do well. And within that space, there's a lot of really reckless work. So if any of you feel moved to be kind of systematically part of field building around these sorts of things, like building bridges and American Gap and Global SL are working to do, please be in contact with any of us or all of us to figure out how that might affect your individual institution. And really appreciate you taking the time to think about it some today.
Brilliant. And thanks again to you, Eric. Really appreciate it. Again, that's globalsl.org. Eric, do you want to give your email address one more time?
Sure. It's ehartman, EHARTMAN, @ksu.edu.
Perfect. Well, thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed the long weekend, and the next one that's coming up, even though it's not quite as long, enjoy the final few days of summer if you still have them. So again, thank you to everyone for joining us, and stay tuned.